2 years ago, in 2024, Jonathan Haidt published the book The Anxious Generation. In it, Haidt argued that the troubling rise in teen anxiety and depression in recent years has been caused by the growing use of mobile phones and social media among teens. The book sparked an international conversation about technology use by children and teens, leading to new school policies banning student use of mobile devices and new government policies setting age limits on who can sign up for social media accounts. I have no doubt that some uses of mobile phones and social media have had a serious negative impact on teen mental health. But I've always felt that Haidt's analysis and conclusions are overly simplistic, ignoring important distinctions between the very different ways that different teens engage with technologies. When teens create and share digital games, stories, and animations, as they do with the Scratch and OctoStudio platforms developed by our Lifelong Kindergarten research group, we've seen how their experiences are radically different from other teens who simply watch videos and scroll through social media on their devices. So I've been intrigued by the work of researchers who provide alternative perspectives to Jonathan Haidt's singular focus on the dangers of mobile phones and social media. And that's why I decided to invite Peter Gray to join me for this episode of the podcast. Peter, a professor at Boston College, is one of the world's leading authorities on the role of play in children's lives. Like Jonathan Haidt, Peter's very concerned about the rise in mental health issues among teens. But Peter has a very different explanation. In his research, Peter has documented how children and teens today have fewer opportunities for self-directed play and how they face greater pressures from standardized testing in school, and how these restrictions have had negative impacts on children's creativity, socialization, emotional development, and mental health. I hope you'll listen to my conversation with Peter with an open mind and think about what types of experiences are most important in supporting or undermining children's development and well-being. Hi, Peter. Welcome to the Lifelong Kindergarten podcast.
Hi, Mitch. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, I've been really excited to talk with you, but I've always admired your research and ideas on the important role of play in children's lives, and I've sort of re-engaged with some of your work recently with in relationship with the much discussed book by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, in which he argues that the rise and the growth of cell phones and social media is a primary cause for the rise in teen anxiety and depression. And I know you're also very concerned about teen mental health issues, but focus on a different set of issues and causes, especially focus on the challenges of the decline in children's opportunities for self-directed play and self-directed learning. So actually, I'd like to start out by just talking about this important role of play in children's lives. I know you've thought about this a lot, but let's just start by sharing, if you can share a little bit about why play is so important in children's lives and well-being.
Yes, of course. Let me preface it, since you mentioned Jonathan Haidt's book, let me preface it with this. The peak of anxiety and depression and suicide among teenagers was 1990. Most people don't know that. There was a huge increase between 1950 and 1990. Over that 40-year period, there was almost a linear increase in suicide rate among teenagers, and by various measures in anxiety and depression, huge increase. So the rate of suicides among teenagers increased fourfold between 1950 and 1990. The reason I'm saying that we had this peak in 1990 is this was before the computer age. This increase was not the result of computers. We didn't have computers. So then, very interesting, we can get to this later if we have time for it, almost nobody realizes that today that we reached that peak then. But then there was a decline. Things got better between 1990 and 2010, and then around 2010 they got worse again. So any thought about the role of computers and so on has to be put in that context. Jonathan Haidt acts as if the world began in 2010. He doesn't show us what was happening before that. So that's
Yeah.
that's something that we might want to come back to.
Yeah. Maybe great for those early years, like leading up to 1990. I know
So
that connects with a decline in children's opportunities to play. So maybe you could talk about.
So the decline in children's opportunities to play began in the 1950s. It had been occurring all along. It had been occurring. This is not a new thing. So, for example, the historian Howard Chudicroft wrote a book on the history of play in America, and he described the first half of the 20th century as the golden age of children's play. And he described how, really, from about 1960 on, he pegs the turning point at 1955 for certain reasons. From about 1955 on, adults began chipping away at children's freedom ever more. Every decade, children were less free than they were before. And so, what I put together some years ago is that, of course, is a correlation that so we had this decline in children's opportunities to just go outdoors and play freely, and we had an increase in anxiety, depression, and suicide. Everything I know about play says that shouldn't be surprising. And it shouldn't be surprising to think that there's a cause-effect relationship. Children are designed to play. They're designed to grow up by playing. Their play makes children happy. You take away play, and they're not going to be so happy, and that means they're depressed, right? I
And
mean,
you were
this is
fortunate
kind
enough
of
to
a
have.
no-brainer, right? I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. So
And it
that's
seems that you personally did have a lot of those opportunities in your own life when you were growing up.
so I had a lot of those opportunities as I was growing up, but I could also see even during my growing up the changes that were already occurring. So, for example, let me give you an example. So, in the 1950s, which was most of my childhood, um, play really meant you went outdoors, as other kids were going outdoors, and you got up a game. No adults around. By the 1960s, we had a lot of adult-directed recreational sports activities. More and more kids were already beginning to do that instead of playing. That's not play.
Yeah.
That's like school. That's you're a puppet there. You're being told what to do. Not that I'm against it. If you really want to do those things, that's great, but it's not a replacement for play. It's
But so
not the
your
same
focus is really
experience.
on like play that's self-chosen and self-directed by
Play
children.
is self-chosen, self-directed. Play is where you learn how to solve your own problems because there's no adult solving them for you. It's where you learn to negotiate with your playmates to figure out the rules of the game and to really play, and where you're free to quit. You play as long as you want to play, and when you're not having fun anymore, you leave it, which is one of the reasons why in real play, children are far less likely to get injured than they are in adult-directed sports. In adult-directed sports, they may play the game beyond the feelings that they would really rather quit because they're in some pain or they're exerting themselves more than they should or they're pitching when they shouldn't be pitching that many times and so on and so forth. So that
I know that
that was just one of the in my new book. I have a new book called Restoring Childhood, and in one of the chapters I list 11 changes, social changes that occurred between 1950 and 1990, all of which reduced children's opportunities to just go out and play.
Yeah. And I know one thing that I always value with play is the opportunity to make mistakes with low consequence and then try it again and do it again. And that feels so important for children developing the creativity and learning new things and being willing to make mistakes and learn new things through that.
Well, exactly. Play, you can think of play as the practice space for the real world because you can try new things without worrying about whether you fail. Nobody's judging you if it's real play. No, but you are free to experiment. You're free to try things that you're not very good at. You're free to try new ways of doing things. Those pickup games of baseball, we tried catching behind our backs. We tried all kinds
Yeah.
of, the big kids would bat with a broomstick. We'd do all kinds of things that you wouldn't do in a real game, but we're far more creative. And in some ways, we're more likely to develop real general athletic abilities than if you were just doing exactly what the coach wanted you to do in a little game.
But I know also I was interested when when a little later on through the 90s and early 2000s, computers did enter children's lives. And sometimes people see that as a whole separate category. But I know that you feel that there are ways for children to be playful in their engagement with technology.
Absolutely. So I mentioned that teen mental health improved between 1990 and 2010. Why did it improve? I've looked at every possible reason, and there's only one reason that makes sense. That's when we got computers. By the early 1990s, most families in America that had a teenager had a computer. By the end of the 1990s, most families in America that had a teenager had not only a computer but an internet connection. Teenagers and younger kids too, now had a new way to play, and it was play. And there is a lot of research done at that time that showed that those kids, controlling for all other factors, those kids who were playing computer games and were communicating by computer were doing better psychologically than those who weren't. There was a kind of restoration of childhood because suddenly now kids had a way of playing with other kids without adults being in their faces all the time and telling them what to do and controlling what they're doing. They had a way of escaping adult control, which children need to do. This is how children become adults, is by escaping adult control and doing things and making mistakes and learning from their mistakes and creating their own activities, learning they can solve their own problems and learning that they can negotiate with their friends, learning that they can deal with minor bullying and they don't fall apart, learning that they don't need to be protected and guided all the time. This is something that already by 1990, it was harder and harder for children to do this. Suddenly now they had their own new world, which they tried to shield from their parents.
Yeah, it was harder for them to do it out in the world because their parents were being protective of them.
Because already by that time, parents were, it was 1980 that the term stranger danger came into our vocabulary. There was a horrid case of a child who was abducted and murdered, a 6-year-old, and it was a huge news splash, and of course this is an extraordinary rare occurrence. I mean, but yeah, you get this image in your head and you think how awful it is, and what if that happened to my child? And there was a major campaign, and very quickly there was a change really beginning. The change had begun for other reasons before that, but around 1980 is when parents began to think that they would be negligent parents if they allowed their children to walk to school by themselves or to go play in the park by themselves and so on and so forth. That view grew increasingly over time, but it was already present by 1980.
Yeah, I do think what you're saying seems to align with, in our group, we often say we want to support children in 4 Ps: projects, passion, peers, and play. To give them opportunities to work on projects based on their passions in collaboration with peers in a playful spirit. And that can happen out in the world, but also can happen with other materials and other technologies. So I
Right.
think we're always looking to see how we can support that, and play is an important element of that.
Well, this is what children naturally do when they're
Yeah.
free to do what they want to do.
Yeah.
All those things that you just mentioned, that's what they do.
Yeah. Uh, so then I know that, as you said, that there was that there was an improvement in children's mental health, large scale indicators, up until 2010 or so, and that's when at least Jonathan Haidt says, well, that's when the cell phone came and social media came. But I know you have some other factors and other possible causes. Maybe you can say, why do you see that the challenges with teen anxiety start to rise again?
So, so I have really delved into the research on, first of all, the research on effects of social media and video games and so on and so forth and smartphones. And Jonathan Haidt's book ignores the research. What he did is he hired an assistant to create a Google Doc that that basically consists of studies that the research assistant found that seemed to support the Jonathan Haidt theory. Jonathan Haidt does not refer to the numerous reviews, meta-analyses. There are hundreds of studies of the relationship between social media use, smartphone use, and anxiety and depression of kids. Every single major review by the people who really do this work, every single meta-analysis of this work shows that if there's any relationship at all between the use of social media or smartphones or screens in general and anxiety or depression, it's a very small, clinically insignificant one. So there are longitudinal studies, and I've looked at the longitudinal, and there have been meta-analyses of the longitudinal studies. What they show is that the anxiety and when there's a relationship, the anxiety and depression generally precedes the increase in anxiety in smartphone and or social media use. It makes logical sense. If you're anxious, you're a little less likely to go out and meet people in person. You're a little more likely to try to compensate by meeting people online. And you may actually, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that shows this is true. You may actually be using social media and you may be using your smartphone and your computer to seek help, to find ways of helping yourself overcome the problem.
So if it's not about the rise of cell phones and social media use, to what do you attribute the rise of teen anxiety
Right. So the
starting in
question
2010?
is, what else happened beginning around 2010? And the answer for anybody who really looks at the data is glaring. What happened is Common Core. First of all, this rise in anxiety, depression, and suicide is a United States phenomenon. It occurred in a couple of other countries,
And
and I have an
this is referring to changes in school curricula where there's more standardization of curricula and
right.
focusing on testing in the
Now,
curriculum. So it's
Now,
about a
it
more
it has always been the case, and this is not, school has a halo around it. So most people, even who know these data, don't talk about it. But school has always been the major source of anxiety, depression for kids. Every summer, the rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide plummet. They go way down every summer, and they go back up again when school starts. Every survey that asks kids what's stressing you out, school far and away is the major stressor that they cite. Let me describe two studies that just happened to have been done. One is in 2009 and one in 2013. Now, Common Core, as you mentioned, was this federally mandate, came ultimately out of the No Child Left Behind Act, which was then modified to be the Every Child Succeeds Act. But it really took teeth beginning in 2010 when the states, in response to the mandate that they prove that children are improving on scores on standardized tests. In order for the state to get state aid and the schools to get then aid from the states, for states to get federal aid and schools to get state aid, Common Core was a change that changed the way that teachers are evaluated, the schools are evaluated, as well as how students are evaluated, that resulted in a disempowerment of teachers in the classroom. Teachers now had to teach a particular curriculum. They felt that they had to teach to the test. And that meant that teachers were not free, or at least felt they weren't free, to use their common sense, their wisdom, to adjust what they were doing, to meet what they could see were the real needs of the children in their classroom. School became far more stressful than it was before. Recesses were cut down even further than they were before.
So more stressful both for teachers and for students.
And there's a
And
lot of evidence for teachers and for students, for school principals, for administrators too, because they're on the line now. Everybody's biting their nails. Are those students going to improve their test scores? So it became it. So it turns out the Common Core was adopted by most states in 2010. It didn't become fully functional in most states until 2013. So there was a gradual change between 2010 and some states didn't adopt Common Core, but they adopted something very similar to Common Core. It was something like 46 states out of the 50 or 45 adopted Common Core, and the rest adopted something similar. So this was a dramatic change. Now, it shouldn't surprise us that a change in schooling that makes school more impressed would have a massive effect on children's mental health. This should not surprise us. Children spend more time in school than in any other setting except for home. In school, they are not free. In school, they are micromanaged. They are constantly judged. They are constantly being compared to their peers. They are told whether they fail or pass, and some of them get the message partly from home, partly from the pressures that surround them, that anything less than an A means failure. Some of them are in that category. It should not surprise us that a change in federally mandated change in schooling that changes it everywhere would have a dramatic effect on children's mental health.
so
And
you
it
might
did.
say that, as you said, like from the 1950s to the 90s, children became more constrained at home in what they're able to do. And
Right,
then maybe in the 2010s, they became more
right.
constrained at school. They were always constrained at school, but even more constrained
Even
and
they
less
became
able
even
to.
more so. Now they became between 1950 and 1990, they also became more constrained in school, but not to the stepwise degree.
Yeah.
So for example, the school year between 1950 and 1990, the school year increased by 5 weeks. So that a whole month of summer basically was taken away from kids. This homework was unknown when I was in elementary school, at least in the schools I was in. Once in a while, we'd be asked to write a book report or something like that, which was kind of fun, or write a poem at home or a story. But we did not carry worksheets back in home. When we were out of school, we were out of school. So one of the things that chipped away from children's freedom, even between 1950 and 1990, was the increased amount of time kids had to spend at school and doing schoolwork. But it was a gradual change. In 2010, we had this stepwise change, a sudden change.
Mm.
and so and so I was about to refer to the American Psychological Association does a survey called Stress in America. I think they do it every year or pretty close to every year. They happen to do, usually they only include adults, but it happens that in 2009, which was the year before Common Core was brought into any schools, and 2013, which was after Common Core was in existence in essentially all the schools, they included teenagers. They weren't studying the effect of Common Core, but it just by coincidence, in my mind, by a happy coincidence, they happened to include teenagers in those 2 years. Same questions, same checklist of what's causing stress. In already in 2009, the most cited cause of stress that the teenagers cited was school. There was a checklist, and school is one of the things. You could check more than one thing, but far and away the most checked thing was school. 43% checked school, nothing else was close to that. In 2013, same checklist, 83% checked school. Huge increase. There was a doubling of the number of kids who were saying school is stressing me out. Again, nothing else came close. All the things that adults tend to think are stressing kids out, like bullying or family problems, relationship problems, worrying about my appearance. Not that those things aren't factors, but when you ask kids, those are affecting some kids, no question. But when you're thinking about the majority of kids, school far and away is the leading stressor.
Actually, maybe let's talk a little bit about some of the ways of dealing with these challenges. I know you've written about in your own family, you had a son that was experiencing these challenges at school, so you put him into a very different educational setting. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the alternative approaches to schooling and education and learning that you feel could lead to less of the anxiety, challenges for teens.
Yes, well, I have spent part of my career studying self-directed education. So what self-directed education is it's education that comes from the child's own initiative, if we're talking about children. I am convinced and I could go on and on about this, but so I suggest people read my book and read my new book when it comes out called Restoring Childhood. But I am convinced that children come into the world biologically designed to educate themselves. Much of what we think of as children's natural behaviors are self-educative behaviors. Children are naturally curious. They from infancy on, they're always exploring the world. They're trying to understand the world around them. They are, as soon as they can crawl, they're moving around to get to things because they want to see what I could do with this. What is this thing? What happens if I drop it on the floor or if I squeeze it or so on and so forth? They are trying to understand the world. And that drive does not end unless we quash it by putting them in a school where their own curiosity no longer matters, because what counts is the curriculum, whether or not they're interested in it. So curiosity is how children are biologically designed to acquire knowledge. Play is how children are biologically designed to acquire skills. There's really two parts to education. One is acquiring knowledge, one is acquiring skills. So play is doing things. And children, when they are free to play, and they have lots of opportunity to play at all the skills that are important for people to develop everywhere. They play at language, they play at building things, they play at logic as they argue about what they're playing at. They play with fantasy, they play with rules as they create rules in their play. And most of all, they play socially because they want to play more than anything else. They want to play with other kids, and they learn how to get along with other kids. They play deliberately in ways that are emotionally challenging. They climb trees and high enough to evoke some fear. They slide fast down slopes. They do all these things that deliberately are helping them learn courage. So children come into the world designed to educate themselves. I did a study some years ago along with one of my graduate students of children in hunter-gatherer cultures. I did not have the opportunity to live in a hunter-gatherer culture, but I surveyed anthropologists, 10 different anthropologists who had lived in and studied different hunter-gatherer cultures. And in every one of those cultures, there's essentially nothing like school. There is very little didactic teaching. The children learn by looking around, seeing what adults do, and by playing at the kinds of things that they see that adults do. So it turns out that this approach of allowing children to educate themselves works if you create a setting appropriate for our culture that allows these instincts to operate. You can't just kick kids out on the street and expect them to become well educated. That's not going to happen. In a hunter-gatherer culture, you don't have to do anything special because the whole culture is available to the kids and they can see what's happening and they have lots of opportunity. They're not segregated off from what adults are doing as they are in our culture. But I've studied schools, particularly I began with the Sudbury Valley School, which is in Framingham, Massachusetts, and where my son was a student and is now actually a staff member there. I began there, and this is a setting designed for self-directed education. It's been in existence since 1969, so this is not a fly-by-night school. It's got thousands of graduates by now, and it takes children from age 4 on through what we think of as high school age. It does not segregate them by age. It does not establish a curriculum. It does not evaluate them in any way. There are a lot of rules in the school, but they're all made democratically by vote that includes all the students as well as the staff. So this is not anarchy. This is a place that is run by rule of law. The founder of the school, interestingly, Daniel Greenberg, who died a few years ago, his motivation for starting the school is he was a big believer in American democracy. He really believes in democracy. And he asked himself the question, if we want to raise citizens for a democracy, for people who really understand democracy, children need to experience democracy as they're growing up. So what he was really creating was a democratic society for kids.
Yeah. So it seems
where
it's not about
where
it's not about
they made the rules. They
yeah.
enforced the rules. They had basically the same human rights that you and I are presumably guaranteed by the Constitution. They had the right to free assembly, to choose it, to free thought, to freedom of speech that the kids don't have in school. So Danny Greenberg said, you're not going to teach children to appreciate and know how to deal with democracy by putting them in the most autocratic institutions we have in our country, which are schools. There's nothing more autocratic than schools. I remember even as a kid when schools were much looser, we used to laugh. Freedom? Are you kidding me? What? Well, the teacher is telling us what we have to do the next minute.
It does seem like
It's
the
a
best
joke.
way. Yeah, feels like the best
You
way for
don't
kids
teach
to.
democracy by lecturing about it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's not about lecturing about democracy, but letting them experience democracy by
Experiences.
experiencing it.
So Danny Greenberg believed that if you have a setting like this, and as long as you provide what I would call and he would call a rich educational environment in the sense that there's all the opportunity, there's lots of books this was before computers, there's lots of books available. There's equipment for all kinds of things available. There's a lot of kids over ages. There's adults you can ask for help if you want to ask them for help, but they're not going to impose themselves on you. That in that environment, kids are going to get interests in things. They're going to learn. They're going to learn to read. They're going to learn to write, even if nobody is specifically teaching them to do that. And so I got interested. Do they really learn this stuff? And lo and behold, my research convinced me they do. They don't necessarily learn it on the same schedule that you learn it at school, but everybody learns to read. They become big readers because nobody's ever forced them to read. No, they don't develop a negative attitude about reading. They learn to read when they're interested in reading, when they want to read. And similarly with everything else they do, they learn it when they're interested in it.
And it does seem to me that this approach to education would have been important at all times in history, but at the current moment when democracy is under threat, more than a long time, it would seem that it's more important today than ever. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I think that's right. And it's also easier today than ever. And part of that is because of the internet. Self-directed education is easier than it's ever been before. You don't have to go to some particular institution to find something out. You don't have to run off to the library and dig things out if you want to know something. There is such access. You can if you want to learn something, you can learn it from the real experts online, so rather than from some teacher who's doesn't really understand it himself, who's trying to explain it to you.
Okay. Well, it's really great to hear about those experiences and the work that you've done. Maybe to wrap up, it would be great to hear, obviously a lot of parents today are feeling a lot of stress because they see all these challenges and they do know about the increases in teen anxiety and depression, and they see a lot written about what the different influences are. If you could encapsulate, if you were going to give some advice to parents today who have teenage children, what type of advice would you give them?
So the advice that I would give is, so what teenage children are mostly suffering from right now is achievement pressure. The achievement pressure that comes from school, the achievement pressure that comes even from the sports that they're involved in. They're suffering from a kind of sense of perfectionism that is this driving that they have to be proving themselves all the time. There's research that shows that the kids who are in these high achievement environments in school, the ones that are not suffering, are the ones whose parents make it absolutely clear that I love you for who you are, not for how you achieve. I love you for how you are, and who you are is your choice, and I'm supporting that. It's when the kids feel that it's not only the school, but their parents who are judging them based on their achievements. Those are the kids who are suffering the most.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining this discussion. You've left people with lots of things to be thinking about, so I really appreciate all the ideas you have around supporting children in their self-directed play and self-directed learning.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The Lifelong Kindergarten podcast is produced by Mitchell Resnick and Eric Schelling in the Lifelong Kindergarten Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. You can find other episodes, additional resources, and online conversation in our Substack at bit.ly/LLK podcast.